Good afternoon, everyone. Just a little bit of background about myself. Gerry Thurgood. I'm currently the chairman of the NMI Steering Committee, and also I'm the CEO, chairman of a couple of other companies within the semiconductor sector. One is in the supply chain, and the other one is my own company, which is actually manufacturing capital equipment. I've been in the semiconductor sector for over 54 years. First, as I came out of college, I went straight into it. I went into a company called Texas Instruments. And so, from that time, I've actually worked in both the fab side. For many years, I've worked as the sales side. I've worked at the design side. I've worked on the equipment side. I've worked with a large Japanese company doing their corporate strategy in Japan. So I've been a bit of around, and I think there's a couple of people around the room today who have actually met me in my my challenge or my span within the industry. So first of all, I heard of a couple of points that we've heard of today, and one of them was national sovereignty. And I've been here for 50 years, and we saw the demise, we saw the growth of the semiconductor sector back in the 80s and 90s. Then it went away because it went to Asia because the ASP was more attractive in China for the cost. And so we've lost that. But the thing is, we had the sector here with the technology in this country. So where is it going? So when I hear something like today about our national sovereignty, where is it? Can we get a hold of it? Where has it gone? So when we hear about the government saying about national sovereignty, we hear all these little spin-outs. To me, the national sovereignty is divided. And we've got to turn around and say, well, how can we actually bring this together? So if I'd just like to go down a little bit down memory lane, and we've had a lot of people talking about the chip, the semiconductor. Where is it today? What can it do for us? It is a complete enabler in every single thing we do. So, and there's also, when we look at the chip, I call it the chip dynasty, it was developed in 1946 in the Bell Laboratories. The first manufacturing companies for chip companies in the UK were in the late 50s. In the early 60s, we had some of the most inward investment. We had people from like GE, we had National Semiconductors, we had Motorola, we had Texas Instruments. Then we had our own indigenous companies. So we had the Plessis, the Marconis, and so we had the GEs. And so together, we actually all worked together. And so if we just actually, touch the base on that, the chip or semiconductor, as they are collectively named, are embedded in everything we use, ranging from smart toothbrushes, televisions, tablets, automotive, turbines, and they all play practical parts in our everyday life. And I think we've heard of that today about AI and all the other different sectors. The semiconductor chip has gone further and faster than any other technology in connecting the world. How did the chip come to impact every aspect of our society? We have connectivity to every corner of the world, from small villages in Borneo to major cities right across the world. We've heard about how AI can actually work in deforestation. It's phenomenal where we're actually going. It's also empowering. It's got vast data, which centers empowering it. Where are they? We've got AI during COVID. Where is all of this being stored? It's invisible to us, but nonetheless, it takes vast amounts of memory. And then we've got the internet of supporting many other sectors of everyday life. So what I'd like to do is to turn around and say, how can we actually recognize this national sovereignty? How are we going to do it? How are we going to bring it together? So what I'd like to do is actually just go on a little bit of a time warp. And so the time warp for me is to about the time when I first entered the industry. It goes back to about this 1965 time. There were a number of semiconductor manufacturers, basically the TIs, the Motorola's, Plessis in this country. And when you actually look at them, they didn't have the infrastructure we have today. They didn't have the manufacturing companies, they didn't have the equipment companies, they didn't have the materials companies, but they wanted to actually drive this sector. And it's been very successful, as we've seen by some of the presentations. So you had Motorola, they were the ones that invented laminar flow. They also did CVD. What Texas Instruments were the first ones that developed the etchers. And they also went into metallization, AT-CVD. What Plessis in this company were developing crystal polars and packaging techniques. What Ferranti, who were doing test systems in the UK. What Philips, a good example, Philips in Holland, when we look at one of the most enablers of the technology we've got today, when we go down to 2 nanometers, is ASML in Holland. That is the driving force for shrinkage. That was a spin-out of the Philips semiconductor company. If we look at Siemens, they were doing crystal pullers. We had ATS in Italy doing testers. Toshiba themselves in Japan were doing crystal pulling wafers. And so the dilemma they had is, as they were growing, they were making their own equipment, but the dichotomy was that they were actually making the equipment that was being divergent from what they were trying to do. So they started working with equipment companies and saying, right, we are good at the devices, we need to work with equipment companies. So together, they turned around and said, right, how can we actually get a set of standards? Everyone was pulling different size wafers. They had different size flats on the wafers. They had different equipment. Each one was making their own. They needed standardization to drive down costs. And so they said, right, we really needed an organization. You had the equipment manufacturers. So they worked with the semiconductor companies. So they actually split it. The device manufacturers did device manufacturing. The equipment companies went to the equipment companies. Then you had all the infrastructure, materials, gases, sciences. So they turned around and said, look, this is getting too complex. So because there's a conflict between the manufacturer of the equipment and also the end user, they thought, really what we need is someone to enable it to actually form an organization which can be independent, we can set standards and be completely neutral, but be a service to the whole sector. So what they did, and when we go back in those days, there was 3 gentlemen who were presidents of companies. There was Carl Lang, which ran a company called KLA, who we all know today, who is doing testers. Recently they bought out SPTS in Wales. So there's Carl Levy, there was a gentleman called Carl Lang, who was the original founder of my company, which is Thermco, and Carl Lang, and there was another guy called Bill Hugel, who had a company called Hugel Associates, and Bill Hugel was doing early stage lithography. He later sold out to Zeiss, and then obviously then they went into the Philips type regime with the SM steppers. So if you look at these 3 gentlemen, they got together and said, why don't we form an independent group, which was called SEMI. This SEMI would set the standards. They would be the voice of the industry. They would actually they would come up with a strategy. They would work with people doing a thing called the ITRS roadmap and saying collectively, this is where we're going to go. This is the projection we're going to make. And so they came out with a strategy. So it was an organization, not the companies. They worked with the companies, the equipment companies, the material suppliers, and they turned around and said, right, we together can actually form this organization which speaks for everyone. And when I look at the UK today, we turn around and say government, we turn around saying the national heritage, what is it? Our national sovereignty. And we see lots of people popping up saying, we're important, we're more important over here. But it's so fragmented that the government's getting confused. And I think in one of my talks a couple of weeks ago, it's like a whole bunch of ball bearings falling on the floor. And they're trying to pick them up where are they chasing them, and they're getting little clusters. And what we really are trying to say is what we really need is a magnet to bring all these ball bearings into one cluster again. And I see that as the job that we've got actually at the NMI and also at Techworks. So we're going back again. The semiconductor manufacturers want to concentrate on manufacturing. They need to standardize on long-term lead times, the supply chain, which we're seeing problems with today. We need OEM companies want to work with the chip manufacturers, standardization on wafer sizes, shrinkage. But they all had their own business models, and they all had their own interests. So what they wanted is a neutral organization where they could represent both parties, or also the supply companies. And hence, SEMI was born in 1967, which was basically 50 years ago. Today, it is the voice of the global semiconductor, not only the semiconductor, but the technology sector, because many of the equipment we use in semiconductor is the same in plastic electronics. I was at a company a week ago where they were actually doing miniature batteries. They were doing it on glass, but they were using semiconductor technology wafers. So they still need to come to an organization who can represent them. So I'd like to think that, the NMI is 25 years ago, and all I like to think is that really going forward, that, the NMI can actually speak on behalf of the technology sector. And I'd like to think, what do we do? What do we contribute? What have we done in the last about 18 months? And I think Gillian has done a phenomenal job working towards driving it, pulling people together. I've seen more invigorism from all of you saying, right, there's something we need. You know, we need to come, we need a catalyst. And I'd like to think we are the catalyst. We've done great. What we're going to do in the next 2022, what I like to think is take the other thing on, which is going green. I've got the red buzzer there, so I'm already on. So I'm talking about green on the red. But just to quickly sum it up, you know, we've got to actually go green. We've got to look at that. If you look at the semiconductor sector, you know, there was one company in America, one of the big, large companies, in the first quarter of this year, the average they were using was, they were using 581 megawatts a day of electricity. They generated in 1 month 15,000 tons of waste. They went through 330 million gallons of water a week. So when we look at it, when we're looking at what we're going to need to do, my drive for the next year is to look at the green aspect of the semiconductor and all the associated Techworks activity to see what is the policy we've got, how can we drive it, and I'm sure that we can have inward investment if we can prove that we are the green part of the semiconductor sector. And the only thing in closing was, you know, we've got a wonderful word up there, which is actually Techworks, right? And all I would actually say is, you know, tech works, but together. And I'd like to turn around and say that, you know, all of us today can actually pull together, and let's actually put together and identify what our sovereignty is by putting together a portfolio and something that we can collectively represent the government. All right, thank you.